All right, so thank you everyone for being here. This is the third and kind of last of this little webinar series, which is about, it's like how we wanted to provide you with some like little blocks on how to start, maintain and nourish a relationship and then close it. So we're at the end of it now. We're the closing bit. So if you want to look at the others, if you haven't attended them, they've, we have recorded them and they're on our YouTube channel and you can access it from the website. So today it's all about closing. So we're going to close the series and we're going to talk about how to close a relationship. It's again presenting me and Julie. And the purpose of this webinar series, as we said, was very much to continue to develop your knowledge and skills, draw attention on the tools that already are available. So not necessarily a lot of new things, but like more like towards consolidation and making good use of what we have already. And then, drive the focus on specific areas that you guys told us were important to you in your practice. And then really any question, anything you want to share, we're definitely wanting this to be an interactive experience. So whenever you have a question or a comment on something we're talking about, please do. We're going to also ask you actively to maybe answer a few questions as we go through the webinar. So yeah, your participation is really appreciated. So this is going to be the agenda for today. Introduction of the two of us, introduce the topic, and then the toolkit, the theory and practice around it, and to introduce some practical exercises. Okay, Claire? Okay, good to know. Yes, please try to exit and enter again. Okay, thank you, Judy, for letting us know, and good, Elisenda. Okay. So then, who are we?
Connected to mobile device.
Huh? Okay, I'm not sure what's happening with the audio. Who are we? So then probably you already know us. I would imagine most of you know us. I've been a field worker since 2010 in MSF, and I've been working with the mentoring since 2012. I'm also the mentoring program manager for intersectional field comms mentoring, and I'm responsible broadly for the continuous professional development offer that we have intersectionally for all mentors. I'm also the one that developed with Jules and the support of all the other mentoring program managers the induction for mentees that is now launched. So please do go have a look on the website and tell us what you think about it. And then I'm a coach since a year now, and I do coach internally MSFers. Julie, what about you?
Thanks, Agnese. Well, afternoon and welcome everyone to the webinar. Really nice to see a group of 9 or 10 today, which is really super. So thanks for joining. I think most of you might know me already looking at the names I can see on the list. And that I teach on mentoring and coaching programs primarily at postgraduate level and to some extent undergraduate, but I also teach in organisations externally outside of my university role. And one of the programs that I run is the Programme Manager Training Programme, which is a new accreditation with EMCC, which is one of the accreditation bodies. And I also deliver a programme for the NHS, for the Leadership Academy in the UK, to train mentors and accredit them at practitioner level. In addition to that, I also have a lead role with EMCC Global, and I look after the accreditation for mentoring and coaching programmes. And in 2016, I started working with MSF and the Mentoring and Coaching Hub to accredit their mentoring programme, which we did actually in 2017. And they'll be re-accrediting this year, actually, as it's been 3 years since we did that accreditation, as well as the training programme for their EQA Training Award. So I've done a lot of accreditation work over the last 3 to 4 years, both in terms of designing programmes and then accrediting organisations. And then the third area that I work on quite significantly is research. So that probably takes up about a third of my time. And I've been leading on 3 impact research projects with the Mentoring Coaching Hub, The first is a completed project now. We're in the dissemination phase, which is looking at the impact of mentoring. And I'll talk a bit more about that in a moment. We've just started the interviews looking at the impact of coaching within MSF. And the third project is the impact of team coaching. So team coaching in HQ and in partner sections, team coaching in the field. So we're about 2/3 of the way through that project as well. So by 2021, we'll have finished both the mentoring impact evaluation, the coaching impact evaluation, and the team coaching impact evaluation. So we'll be able to share those outcomes with all of you, and where the mentoring and coaching hub goes from there in terms of that offer around CPD, training and development for mentors and coaches. So I'm going to be looking at the first part of the presentation, which is just looking at a little bit of theory around this particular topic, which is closing the relationship. And I'm going to refer to the research that we've done. And then Agnese is going to come back in with just recapping on some of the existing tools that you have. And then we'll both together, we'll close together with Q&A. But if there are any questions along the way, please post them in the chat box. And we're happy to pause along the way and just to sort of have a conversation around anything that might be on your mind. Now, I can see that with a couple of you are having a few problems. So it may be that you need to log in, log out, or change the browser. So I'll let Agnese just have an overview of the chat box and to see what's happening there. And then I'm going to carry on with the session for the moment. Okay, so for those of you that attended the first two webinars, you would have seen this slide. I think most of you looking at the names were at the first two, but there might be one or two of you that were not. So just to recap, we conducted a 2-year impact evaluation of the mentoring relationships, primarily in the field. So the mentoring for field workers. And we looked at both in terms of individually and for the mentoring relationships and for the mentoring coaching hub and MSF more broadly, what was the impact? So we looked at different levels, we looked at different lenses, we looked at different outcomes. And one of the things that did come up in the research was around the idea of actually formally closing the relationship and celebrating the relationship outcomes. And that's something that came up as one of the themes in the research, is that, yes, there was significant impacts around helping people with their well-being, the self-care for field workers, the professional development of field workers, the confidence, self-esteem, those aspects. But when we looked at the dynamics of the relationships in terms of the start, the middle, and the end, one of the things that did come up in the research was actually the processes around formally closing the relationship, capturing the learning, celebrating the success, and actually what would we do along the way if perhaps the relationship was not transitioning as we thought it might be. Now, we touched on that in the last webinar, because in the last webinar we talked about maintaining and sustaining the relationship. But I think that the two topics are connected, the topics of maintaining and sustaining the relationship with these ups and downs and peaks and troughs, and actually thinking about formally closing the relationship and when is the best time to close. And so we're going to talk more about that throughout the webinar, because I think that is a topic that as I say, it is related, it does come up, you know, when to close, and this idea of maintaining and sustaining. You know, how long do you maintain and sustain a relationship for? Is it indefinitely, you know, forever potentially, or not? And interestingly, with the research, what we found is that nearly in all relationships, the relationships formally close to a degree, and we'll talk about that as well, formal closure, but actually the vast majority of relationships continued, and they continued in an informal way. So they transitioned from a formal mentoring relationship, which in a sense came under the umbrella of the mentoring and coaching hub, and they then transitioned into informal relationships, which almost were no longer within the mentoring coaching hub. The informal relationships were self-managed by the mentor and the mentee. And some of these relationships have been ongoing for 3 to 4 to 5 years. And mentees and mentors would dip in and out. So they'd be in and out of that informal relationship. But that was very much in the research, it showed that they were self-managed relationships. So we might talk a bit more about that again today, if that's a topic that people would like to discuss further. Okay, so that's a summary of the research. So thinking about closing the relationship. So when might you close? What might we think about when we're closing the relationship? What kind of areas might we touch on? And I think one of the areas, as I mentioned with the research, is actually thinking about, do we need to extend the relationship? Do we need to continue the relationship? Do we need to transition into a different kind of relationship? So do we need to move from that formal relationship to more of the informal relationship? If we are formally closing the relationship, whether that's the formal closure and transitioning to informal, how purposeful should it be? So in a sense of actually, do we have that formal conversation around, this is the stage that we're at, this is the conversation that we're having, and actually we're going to spend the next hour or two thinking about that and working through that together. That sort of purposeful closure, rather than the drifting away and the less and less contact, and the relationship fizzles out and there isn't that sort of purposeful closing and looking back. And the looking back is very much associated with reflecting back on the relationship and also looking forward. So when we're reflecting back, is what is the learning that's taken place in that relationship? How have you both developed in the relationship? What's changed for you? So in that 6 months or that 9 months that you've been working together, actually what's changed in that 6 or 9 months for both of you? Because the closing is, yes, it's very much about the mentee's progress, but it's also for you as a mentor to think about what might have changed for you in terms of your practice, your mentoring practice. Because remember, one of the things that we talk about a lot, both in the literature and in practice, is that mentoring very much is a reciprocal relationship. And a lot of you talked about this, and a lot of mentors talked about this in the research, where you talked about the reciprocal nature of the relationship, and that there are benefits and learning for both the mentee and the mentor. So looking back and capturing that learning. And then looking forward, so thinking about actually what are the future needs of the mentee? So does the mentee still want to work with you, but in an informal capacity? Does the mentee need another mentor, but another mentor that has different contextual experience perhaps, or has had a different professional role perhaps? And actually thinking about that. Or does the mentee actually need a coach? Would they like a coach going forward? And what's the distinction between a coach and a mentor? Or does the mentor simply need to work with a professional friend, for example? What does their development network look like? So really thinking about, where is the mentee going next? What are the mentee's needs when moving to that next role, that next phase in their career within MSF? Because often the mentoring is associated with a field worker's position for a fixed period of time. And when they return and they move to a different role, often that role can be for a promotion, it can be a different role, a different context. So therefore their needs may change in that different role and that different context. And then another aspect to think about when closing is actually the celebration and the thanking of one another. And this is something that came up in the research, how important it is to really celebrate, to give thanks to one another, to appreciate the time, the energy and the commitment that you've made as a mentor to the mentee, but also that the mentee has given you in the relationship. Again, that sort of reciprocal dynamic of the two of you, thanking, celebrating, and closing, which is really key. And I think most of these points, if not all of these points, came up in the 2-year research project that we did with mentors and the mentees. I'm going to show you a model. Some of you might be familiar with this model, and it's a model that was created by Professor David Clutterbuck, and it was a model looking at the transition of mentoring relationships. And some of you will have seen this previously, perhaps in presentations or previous webinars. And it really looks at the different phases of the mentoring relationship. And his research considered formal mentoring programs. So it looked at typically 12-month mentoring relationships or shorter, but where they were formal, organized within an organization. and it looked at the relationship between the intensity of learning and time. So the time phases of the relationship. And we can see here that within the model itself, we talked previously about direction, progress, and maturity. But often when we come to the end of the relationship and the relationship has matured and the mentee has completed their role, completed their mission, perhaps they've gone back home for a period of time, they're moving then to a new mission, to a different role or the same role. At that point, the learning often we find lessens quite significantly because the mentee perhaps has gotten what they've needed in terms of their development from yourself and from the role. And so therefore the learning can drop off. Now there is a question as to whether the learning drops off quite as sharp as it appears in this model here. Because what we see is quite a sharp dip, don't we, in terms of the line if we follow it. And there is a question as to whether actually there is that sort of almost triangle that we see there, that sharp point and the sharp drop. Sometimes the learning, the dip in the learning can be more subtle than that. So it's not quite so angular when we think about the learning in the relationship. But what is very clear with the research and the model is that the closing of the relationship is an important phase within the relationship. And it's important to acknowledge that, just as it's important to think about how we build rapport with one another, how we build that trust, that degree of honesty and disclosure when we build direction. At the other end of that relationship, the how being how do we close that relationship and capture that in a very positive way in light of what's been learned in the relationship. So a useful model, there are other models that are starting to emerge. And we've just launched our interviews with our coaching impact research. And I was just saying to Agnese earlier in the pre-phase of the webinar, what's very interesting is something very early on that's emerging is that what some of the coaches are describing is that the relationship actually might be much more of a wave. So a wave being these sort of very subtle ups and downs in the relationship, rather than this striking, pointed, angular approach to the phases in the relationship. So what's interesting, I think, is that next year we'll be able to present what the coaches describe as the phases and then compare our mentoring research with the coaching research and to see some of those similarities and differences, which I know some of you on this webinar will be really interested in seeing that, because I know you're, some of you, perhaps might be mentors and coaches and you're interested in that correlation between the two interventions. So I think that will be really interesting next year. Now, moving on to the next slide, there are, of course, the idea of these different lenses that you can look at when you're thinking of closing the relationship and you're at that stage. And the picture here, I suppose, demonstrates the different lenses that we have. And when I say lenses, I guess these are the different aspects that we can think about when we're actually in that closing phase and we're having the conversation around closing. And if I just briefly talk around each of those, because I'm conscious of time. The first is that we might think about the mentoring process itself. So when we talk about the process, what went well when we think about those phases, so the beginning part of the relationship, the middle and the end. What were some of the successes, what were some of the bumps along the road, some of those undulating sort of ups and downs that you might have experienced, what went well and not so well. Learning. So what learning has taken place in the relationship as a mentor? What is it that you've learned? What is it that the mentees learned? What have you learned together? Perhaps about one another or about mentoring in itself as a development tool. Change. So we talked about what changes have taken place for both yourselves in terms of your mentoring practice, perhaps, but also for the mentee. What's changed and how has the relationship that you've developed perhaps contributed to that change? Has mentoring contributed in a positive way to the changes that have occurred? The celebration. So what positives do you take away from the relationship? Oh, wonderful. Thanks, Claire. I can see it works. So that's great. So what positives do you take away from the relationship? And what would you like to give thanks for? So, really, really important in that closing phase. The future. So what does the future look like in relation to mentoring and more broadly for your mentee? I'm sure your mentee might be interested in your future mentoring. Will you still be available to mentor them in a different capacity in the future? And then thinking about, again, these different lenses, if we were to look at the programme more broadly, so bearing in mind that mentoring sits within the Mentoring and Coaching Hub in MSF, is as a mentor, what would you like in terms of support from the Mentoring and Coaching Hub? So thinking about your relationships and what's worked well and perhaps not so well, are there things that you would like from the Mentoring and Coaching Hub? So CPD, as an example, this kind of thing that we're doing here around webinars, are there other tools and techniques that you would like? For the mentee, thinking from the mentee's perspective in terms of their program induction, the transition through the program, is there anything else that your mentee might like from the program team, from the Mentoring and Coaching Hub? What more would they like from the team? So you can almost lift the closure sort of outside of the relationship to think about that holistic system. Oh, sorry, Annie. So CPD, so when we talk about CPD, it's continuing professional development. So developmental support. So you have your, as mentors, you have your 3-day induction program. But then in addition to that, what support would you need along the way to support you? And so that's what we describe CPD as, that ongoing support. So as I say, with these different lenses, it's thinking about lifting yourself outside of the relationship and then thinking about the program, the supportive system around the relationship. What more as a mentee or as a mentor would you like from the system that supports your mentoring relationship? So the support framework that sits around that. So whether that is the Mentoring and Coaching Hub, or it could be even more broadly, MSF as a movement, as an organisation, what would you need from MSF as a movement and an organisation? And I'm not suggesting that the Mentoring and Coaching Hub can fix everything, but it's just good to feed back to Agnese and the team. What support can they provide, and what support might you want more broadly from the organisation? So lots to think about. I think often people have said to me in the past that they might have underestimated the closing phase of the relationship in terms of how important it is and just how much there is to talk about in that closing phase, and all of the different dimensions and the different angles and lenses that you can think about when you're closing the relationship. And then there's just a couple more slides from me, and I'll move on to Agnese because I'm conscious of time. So 3 things to think about is the when to close the relationship. So this is often something that comes up, when to close. And then I think we'll pause for a moment. Agnese, did you want to say something?
Yeah, I think I can take these slides.
Yes, great. Yeah,
right.
Lovely.
And I'm really sorry you guys are experiencing some problems. Sharif, I'm not sure I can see the ID. Maybe someone can help. I don't know if you guys can see it. Maybe if someone can write to him. Yeah, so basically these next slides are a bit of a recap from what Julie has been talking about in the previous slides. So when is it that we want to close the relationship, right? So like a normal kind of natural end and closure of the relationship could be the end of the period we've established to continue the relationship for. So for example, a field assignment, if it's the mentoring in HQ, maybe you've decided in advance to have it for like 6 months, and then you decide to close it. So that's a natural, in a way, life of the relationship. And then there's like for example, the mentee might need another type of support. Also, Julie mentioned some of those, and we're going to look a bit more in details what these type of supports could be. Or it could be that you got to the maturation phase of the relationship that Julie was presenting also before in the graph, so that objectives are met and maybe it's time to move on. So yeah, let's look at the next slide. So for example, if you look at field assignment, when the field assignment is over, or the time that you decided to dedicate to this relationship is over, then what are your options? Of course, to end the relationship. And what many mentors and mentees do is to continue informally. That is great. That is something we encourage even. It's like if you feel the relationship has evolved to, maybe a broader support or, maybe less intense sometimes, but you want to kind of keep the relationship going in other, with a little reframing maybe around it is recommended, so that you make sure the expectations are, again, aligned. And I guess here the only issue we would like you to pay attention to might be that if you start many mentoring relationships and you feel like you want to continue informally all of them, that might be really at one point probably not sustainable. And plus, like, we need, as a program, we kind of look at all the offers that come in, all the requests that come in, and try to make the best judgment on where is it that it's the most needed, your support. So in that sense, we would still like you to be available for those we identify as mentees. So from a program perspective, it's very useful that you keep being available and you're not maybe too invested in relationship that, like, again, like, why is it that you continue that relationship informally? Maybe that needs to be clarified. What is the goal? And I think I want to challenge you a bit there. Like, is it a mentoring or is it a friendship? And if it's a mentoring, are you sure that that's really what the person needs to go on? Or because sometimes it happens that people are just so enjoying the relationship that they find it difficult to kind of sever that tie, sever that connection. Okay, so moving on, the other scenario was, what if, the mentee needs another type of support? So of course you're not a, career manager or development advisor, nothing like that, but you as a mentor have the knowledge of what the system can offer, what our organization can offer. So you can say, maybe we are done and maybe your learning development path is taking you somewhere else. So maybe you can consider different options within the two of you, within the pair. So for example, reframing it, or other options that are maybe like a training or a completely different type of support. Maybe you've identified some technical areas in which the mentee could need support, and you can just, suggest that they would discuss this with their development advisor or whatnot. Of course, the other option is to end the relationship. Or continue reframing the relationship. So for example, we hear a lot, like, if the mentee's issues, the dilemmas or the issues the person is facing in that moment are, for example, of psychosocial nature, if they need maybe, serious support from a psychologist, for example, what do I do? Do I stop the mentoring or what? And so, like, what we always try to say is, like, it makes a lot of sense to continue it, because they know you, they've been sharing their path with you, they've been opening up to you. There's a trust that in that moment is even more valuable. So I would say maybe rescope the relationship in a way that it can be complementary to the support the person is receiving outside of your relationship, and continue it. That would be our suggestion. And then of course you need to know, what you feel comfortable doing. So it could also be, for example, instead that they need coaching and you might have a sense of what coaching is. And so you might say, you could, look at that, for example, that option. For example, like if the person is entering their second or third assignment in the same profile, in the same position, maybe what they need is to be challenged a bit more and to go maybe a bit deeper into their styles or other issues. And that might not necessarily be mentoring that, thereafter. So the third scenario is that objectives are met, right? So it's the maturation phase that Julie was mentioning. So you might experience a sense of, because it's not always so clear cut, like, okay, great, objectives are met and it's all good. So, it requires a bit of like reading a bit the relationship, reading the signals from the mentee. And so here's when you might want to bring up that and say, I might feel that we've actually achieved this. Maybe this is a moment to celebrate. And so looking back maybe at the objectives, see the path that you guys have shared together and the achievements. And so then, of course, you can end the relationship, or you can reframe it and agree on new goals, or you can also help the mentee mentor their team. So some of the tools you might have been using within the team, within the pair, you and the mentee, you can propose the mentor to use them with the team, and you kind of transfer that knowledge forward to the mentee. Also, like, again, for the objectives to be met, there has to be an attitude throughout the relationship of the mentor of kind of, not creating dependency, but, promoting the autonomy of the mentee. And so kind of giving feedback and acknowledging every time, the person is actually showing those skills and showing how they're completely empowered in the new position, confident, build that trust, that self-confidence in the mentee, so that, they might not feel that then they're just surviving because of you, because that's not what you want. So it's an attitude throughout the relationship. So these are some tips that we hear from mentors every now and then, and it's like, what is it that really makes a good closure? And again, there's a lot of actually things that actually you do throughout the relationship that ensure a good closure. So, for example, things like mirror back and acknowledge. It's a bit what I was talking about. It's like this constant feeding back the progresses that you see the mentees doing, and also feeding back when you see that actually the mentee is ready to let go of that relationship. And sometimes I feel mentors are a bit concerned to kind of say it as if they are abandoning the mentee maybe, or they want out. And that's not the case. It's just about being transparent and authentic and showing the mentee where he's at. So, for example, if you see, that the sessions are getting more, like there's more and more time in between session, you can just, without necessarily forming a meaning about it, but just reflect back, mirror back the what you see. So you can say, I've noticed that, we talk less and less. What's happening? Are we maybe done, or are we maybe needing to look at other goals, or are and you can raise all these questions. It's information that they might not be aware of. That's the thing. So again, about autonomy, pointing back at their autonomy. And a lot of mentors have said that the formal closure is really key. Even if you want to continue the relationship informally, even if you're going to become friends, to just take that moment. It's like almost like pushing a bit the past and the future, and making that space for that present, and say, wow, what's happening now? And give the weight to the whole relationship that it actually deserves. And sometimes that's just all what people need to let go of it. And also there was a lot of recommendations on preparation. So to make sure that you prepare, that you go through maybe the notes you've taken throughout the relationship, not to look at them during the closing session, but maybe prepare before, so that you know what you want to say. And also they were also talking about the timing, which is important, not to wait too long, after, for example, the person is back from the field, because that might mean that he or she is in a completely different space, taken by many different things, coming back home, catching up with all the people back home, maybe looking for a new job and so on. So everyone was just saying, it's much better if you do it 2 weeks, more or less 2 weeks before the end of their assignment, when they're still in the field, when that is still relevant to them and to their story. Okay, so any questions by now? And if you want to share anything in the chat on how do you close relationships, what's your best practice, if we can all learn from one another, and what are your challenges, maybe, yeah, if you want to start maybe writing and feeding a bit into this discussion, that would be very great. So we're going to be looking now at the existing toolkit we have. So I've put here the relationship closure, the mutual debrief, and the mutual feedback. And these are some of the tools we have in the digital logbook, for example, and also in the website. Under mentoring tools, you can download an Excel sheet with these tools and other tools as well. So moving on. Yes, so in the relationship closure, that's what you're going to also find in the digital logbook. We've defined kind of 3 areas. So there's the objectives, the rapport, and the logistics. And that's the same categorization, the same division we've used for the building of the relationship and the maintaining of the relationship. So what we're basically suggesting is that there's the red threads, that are kind of, when you start the relationship and you follow through until the very end. So by the objectives, you might want to have some reflections around what was the original objectives, how did they change throughout the relationship, and what are we proud of, what were the achievements, and then that we have some questions that you can maybe read by yourselves that we recommend. Yeah, and then when it comes to the report, is instead more like as Julie was saying, also like celebrating one another, thanking one another, basically saying what you need to say to be done with that and at peace with it, with the support you received and with the support you gave. So you can also help maybe the mentor grow for the next maybe relationships that the mentor is going to go into. And for the mentee, it's also important to know how you've perceived and what you felt from them. So you can, and then of course it's also a moment to ask for feedback, but I wouldn't really make it about feedback about the performances. It's more about like a broader sense of like, yeah, what do we need to tell one another? And also, as we know, we learn a lot also from success stories. We don't only learn from mistakes. So it's very important to see like, what is it that makes it a good relationship? What is it that makes it a good closure? And maybe have some reflection around that. Around logistics, it's really about how did that impact the relationship? So what would you do differently? What would you continue doing? What would you stop doing? That's, the start, stop, continue. That's standard feedback we suggest also as a simple feedback in any situation, really. And I guess what's the point here is really, again, to be aware of we're all different. And even culturally speaking, maybe this is even more important. For example, who takes the lead in calling for a meeting? That is very it's colored culturally, so depending from where people come from, they might feel more or less comfortable doing that. So how did the logistics support and bridged your diversity and helped you building bridges instead of the contrary? So then, of course, there's the mutual feedback, and this is there's the link where you can find it in the toolbox on the website. And basically, really, the idea here is to open up to feedback. It's so crucial in MSF. It's so crucial in general in people's lives. And so it's here. I just got this image about the fixed mindset and the growth mindset, right? So the feedback is where we learn. It might not be pleasant all the time. It might not be comfortable at all times, but definitely there's always some learning and some next step, next stretch. So yes, please take the time to do the mutual feedback and do not make it coincide with the last call you have. So maybe do it before and then you can discuss about it in the closing session. And then there's the mutual debrief, and that's really based on the goals and the achievements. So, the original objectives compared to the achievements throughout the relationship and at the end. Again, this you have on the digital logbook. That's the address for the digital logbook, and you should all have a login. And if you don't, please contact Jules. You can check on his address on the website. And if you've lost your passport, you can just click on lost password and get a new one. So we're going to now add some extra toolkit, and I'm going to leave the floor to Julie. And Julie, maybe you've read some of the comments. You have to unmute your mic. Julie, your mic is muted.
There you go. Thanks, Agnese. Yeah, there's a couple of comments that came through. So a couple of comments on the research, Agnese. A couple of our attendees were asking if we could share the research. So, we've got we've got the webinar link and we've got the short report, and whether after the webinar we might be able to share the webinar link and the short report link with the participants.
So the short report is published on the website, so you can find it on the website. Yeah, and we can, yeah. Mm-hmm.
And the webinar link, I think we've got I'm not sure if it's open access on YouTube or not, but the
It is.
that we did, it is.
It is.
Yeah, I just had a quick search and I couldn't find it, but I'm sure that one of the team will have the link for that as well.
Yeah, but then I can definitely send at the end as a follow-up. With the recording of this webinar, I can send the link to the other one. It's all in the same page, in fact. Once you click on it, you see all the webinars we've run.
Lovely. Yeah, so you should see, for those that ask, you should see the 3 links then to this one and the previous 2. And maybe Agnese can also upload the link to the research explanation webinar that we did as well. So then you'll have 4 links. But as well, there is a couple of experiences that were shared here. I'm just going to read them out and we can chat about those. So Roland, we had a good experience with a mentee with whom the closure went very well. We both filled out the evaluation form, lessons learnt, discussed, very open discussion on the last day, and the relationship was closed at the end of the assignment. So that sounds great. Yeah, you know, that's sort of the sort of ideal situation, is to use some of the tools that the Mentoring Coaching Hub have provided, think about what's been learned, think about, you know, going forward, and then do that either, you know, very in that 2-week period coming towards the end. And it might be that you might even want to have one further discussion, which might be 2 or 3 weeks after the mission, when people have had just a little bit of space to, I think one of the mentees described it in the research, to sort of decompress almost, and to have a bit of time to really think in a bit of space, and that might be interesting. And then we also had Claire that talked about, I had the experience of a mentee asking me to feedback on the improvements I could see in her competencies. I found it a bit difficult because it felt she was asking me to evaluate her. I tried to refer her to concrete things I could observe and to revert the question back to her. So what did you see that has changed? What would you advise to address such a request? So from my point of view, I think that's a very interesting one. And I think from my mentoring practice, particularly when I'm mentoring colleagues, perhaps more junior colleagues than myself, it's a frequent one that they actually want feedback. As you say, Claire, you know, they're almost wanting feedback on what do I see and what do I observe. And I must admit, with mentees that I'm working with, I do push back a bit. And one of the things that we look at is where they can almost get 360-degree feedback. So they can get feedback from other colleagues. And I really encourage my mentees to seek feedback from other colleagues, whether that's through a formal process, you know, where the organisation provides some kind of feedback form, which some organisations do, or whether that's actually, you know, giving them 1 or 2 questions and then arranging to have a coffee with a colleague and asking for that feedback. And for some, I think, you know, that can be, they might see that as a bit risky. They might see that as, you know, would I feel comfortable in doing that? But I often push back to my mentees to suggest that the real value sometimes when you're in a new position, it's your first position, is actually getting feedback about what your colleagues have seen over that 3 to 6 to 9 to 12 month period. What is it that they've seen in terms of the changes in you? So that's something that I tend to do. Let's say, what would be your view on that and perhaps your practice?
I think I agree with you in the sense that I would push back a bit, because I think we need to keep separate performance and development, even though, of course, they have a lot of areas in which they overlap. But in mentoring, we really focus on development and not performance. Then if it's performance related to objectives you've set yourself, I would say the same thing. I would go, I mean, definitely the thing is that it's feedback from someone you trust that, you know, is coming from good intention is priceless. It's so powerful when you know that someone really sees you, to know what is their viewpoint on your development. So I would encourage probably the person to collect the feedback, as you said, from colleagues. We have the role analysis as a tool that we use for that. It's super simple structure. You can find it in the tools. And I would also probably investigate a bit, like ask the person, like, what is it that you're lacking? And like, could you get this feedback from your supervisor that is the one that is kind of supposed to provide this type of feedback on your performances. But then again, if the feedback the person is asking is on objectives that you've decided together and something you could witness yourself firsthand, I would probably say it, but usually you don't see the person working in their environment. So you could maybe probably rephrase the feedback on the relationship, on what you saw happening in the relationship. That's your domain. That's where you see it firsthand.
Yeah, I'd agree with that. Something that I do talk about, though, is I do talk about how the focus of the relationship over that 6 or 12 months might have changed, and how the conversation might have changed in that 6 to 12 months. So, for example, I can think of a couple of mentees in this circumstance where I've worked with a couple of mentees over the last 2 years, and when they first started working with me, they are almost in crisis mode and they're completely overwhelmed. They're completely overwhelmed in their situation, in their circumstance. And so the conversation is just about helping them through crisis and helping them to cope and to manage with the day-to-day. And what we found is that, 6 or 12 months later, the conversation changes because, they've moved out of that crisis zone, the red zone as we call it, and they're sort of overwhelmed, and they've moved into more of an amber zone where they're still stretched, but they're managing to cope on a day-to-day basis. And we're able to talk about different topics, and we're able to actually think about more of their development rather than just simply coping. So something I do when I'm asked for feedback is to think about, when we look at the relationship over the 6 to 12 months, is how has the relationship changed, which I think is perhaps what Agnese is describing as well, and how have the topics changed and the focus of that relationship as a consequence of the topics. And so it's feedback, but I guess it's feedback in a different way. So that's what I typically do, but it depends on where my mentee is in their thinking, in their development, and just their general well-being when I first start working with them. Yeah, I'm just looking at Cedric's just added something in the chat box. So I usually come with, in your position, if you don't have a mentor, how could you get the feedback that you're asking to me? Yeah, because at the end, we mentors are pushing for a kind of autonomy, aren't we? Yeah, that's really, really great input. Yeah.
And personally, what I like about it is that it does push for them to become autonomous, right? To kind of internalize the role of the mentor, which is a great thing. I think it's thank you for sharing that, Cedric.
Yeah, great. And of course, when you're thinking about, looking at this slide here, and we're almost there, everyone, with the slides, and then we can get into some more sort of general Q&A. When we're thinking about outcomes, and this is sort of an outcome slide, but what I would say is that, again, it's thinking about different dimensions. You can ask the mentee to think about, in terms of their learning, what has been the learning in the 6 or 12 months that's taken place. And this could be around, for example, this could be around competency development. And these all kind of link very subtly to each other, because that could be a capability outcome as well. So we could view it as, I've learned about, for example, I've got greater self-awareness now. And one of the capabilities is that as a consequence, I've developed my leadership and management style, because I'm more aware of my leadership management style and the impact it has on others in the role. So, all of these are very much linked to one another. Career outcomes, could be linked to, for example, the mentees moving on to a promotion. So quite often in the research, what I saw was we'd have mentees that were moving from, for example, a deputy head of mission to a head of mission. So they were moving to the next mission, or they were moving to a larger mission, a more complex mission, managing, a bigger team. So that was often the case. So, and that would be seen as, a career outcome in that sense. When we think about enabling, often we think about, do I know more now, 6 months later, about, for example, the career pathway and how I get to where I want to be? Do I know more about the organisational structure? Do I know more about the organisational culture? Do I know more about how to navigate my way within MSF? And if I do want to become a head of mission in the long term, do I know more about how I navigate my way? And that's why it's called enabling, because knowing more, having the knowledge of the structure, the culture, the pathways, the way things are done can very much be, you know, an enabling outcome to support someone. And then emotional. So I think for me, for mentoring, this is one of the most significant outcomes of mentoring, is that you are providing a massive amount of emotional support in terms of the mentee growing their self-confidence, growing their self-esteem, their well-being, their resilience. It's huge. But it can take its toll on you as well as a mentor. Obviously, you know, the amount of, you know, the energy that you're giving to that mentee in terms of supporting them emotionally. But I think it's one of the most, if not the most significant outcome of the research, is this idea of the emotional support that grows their confidence and their self-esteem as a consequence of you just being there to enable them to vent, to enable them to talk, to hold up the mirror, to reflect, all of those areas. So when you're thinking about how are you defining success, how are you defining outcomes, what are the areas that you're thinking about when a mentee might say to you, give me some feedback, can you evaluate me? You know, actually you could look at these different areas perhaps and ask the mentee to evaluate themselves based on these different areas. And you know, perhaps you can have some input there as well. And then I love this particular visual here. So this is one of the pictures that one of the mentors provided from the research that we did. And the individual described mentoring as a journey, and that you're on this journey together, and that there's very much a changing landscape, and that where you start is very different to where you end up, you know, a very different position, and that as a mentor, you're supporting the mentee through the different phases in their development, their career journey towards the end of that particular mission. But of course, then there's always this next horizon. You know, what we see in the visual there, you know, the kind of river, and then we can see the mountain on the left-hand side in the distance, this new horizon, and the mountain might represent the next mission that needs to be climbed, you know, the development that needs to happen for the next mission. And are you going to be there for that next mission, informally or formally? Or as Agnese said earlier, does the mentee need a different kind of support that's going to help them through the next phase of their career journey within MSF or outside of MSF even? So I think, you know, the visual for me really captures that moment of signaling the closure, but actually the changing situation, changing landscape, and that new horizon. And of course, there's many visuals in the report that we could share, but you know, there's so many that we'd picked one for today, but there are many others as well. So just really coming to the end here. So these are some of the questions that you might want to think about when you are having those conversations, when you're coming to close the relationship. So, you know, very simply, do you want to continue with the relationship? And if yes, in what form do you do that? Therefore, when answering that question, do you need to enter a new agreement? And what does that look like if you do? What you're going to do next? What's the intention? And then what further support might they need, and the momentum in terms of their career and their development or the relationship. So just some sort of key questions there you might want to have in your mind when you are having that conversation.
Yeah, and before we go to question, I really just, if there's one point I really want you to take with you today is really like, there is a cultural component to how we close a relationship. It could be sensitive, and more direct cultures might just say, you know, that was great, thank you, we're done. And indirect cultures might not be able to say that, to voice that. And so your ability to mirror back with curiosity could really make a difference in managing to close the relationship in a way that is comfortable for everyone. Because it is sensitive. It is a sensitive moment. Yeah. So questions, if there are any. We have 5 minutes left, so not too much. And these were some additional readings we proposed for this particular module. For each module, we've been sharing with you some additional readings. So let us know if you need anything else, or if there's anything you liked most also.
And any feedback, of course, if you'd like to provide any feedback or a word or a sentence in the chat box. around closing of this session.
And also just maybe while some people are writing, I just wanted to share with you that me and Julie, we're going to have the next two webinars are already decided, again, given your inputs. And one is going to be on resilience. And the other one is going to be psychosocial first aid in a way. So like as mentors, how do we contribute and support to the resilience of our mentees, and how do we navigate that space between providing support from a psychosocial perspective, which is just really the first line of support, and then how do we manage to redirect or take care of that need.
Mm.
So no more questions. And Judy, we didn't speak directly to your comments. It would be interesting to know what you found difficult in creating that venting environment.
Yeah, and was there a comment on venting as well? Yeah, Judy. Yeah, I had a mentee that in the end was fired by MSF. Not a bad thing, really. I kept the relationship going for a short while after that, so he would have a place to vent his frustrations. I found it a bit difficult to create that venting environment, but I think in the end, he appreciated being heard. Yeah, I think that's both an interesting one and a challenging one, isn't it? In terms of the thoughts and the feelings a mentee might have. They're fired from their role, but as you say, not a bad thing really, because often it works out for the best for individuals, isn't it, in terms of their personal circumstances. But it's interesting, venting. See, when I did the research, often mentors talked about it in the venting space. They really didn't do a great deal more than simply listen. Was just almost to sit in almost silence throughout and to let someone simply talk. And they described that this could go on for very many minutes. It's just allowing someone to express themselves. One mentor described how their mentee would shout, scream, cry, and the mentor just sat and listened.
And if I can add to that, I would say, Judy, what you're speaking to is the need to self-manage. And, your story sometimes gets so intertwined with theirs because you've, maybe gone through the same experiences, or there's so much passion around our job. And so, yeah, great job there to kind of be able to split between, what was your story and your your come from place compared to the one of the mentees. So yeah, thank you for sharing that. I think that's really relevant for any moment in the relationship. And Cedric, yeah, I would recommend 1 hour for the closure session. And it's an hour in which you're not going to be doing the mutual debrief nor the mutual feedback. That's done. That's been discussed in previous conversation. And then the closure is just really that sort of celebration, the looking forward, the looking back, a bit of the, a bit of a meta view, like putting, back all the pieces of the puzzle together and kind of busking a bit in that success or whatever that is to look at and just take it in.
Yes, I can see Paolo. So yeah, so you're not closed yet, but we'll be doing in the future. So that's great. And yeah, Judy, thank you so much for your contributions, and to all of you, really appreciate your contributions. Thank you so much. Oh, thank you as well with the tips and the discussion.
Thank you. And keep letting us know how we can support you. Please send an email to any of us. Thank you so much.
And look forward to seeing hopefully some of you, all of you on the next webinar. Thanks, everybody.
Bye, everyone. I never remember how to close this.